Alex, thank you so much for allowing us into the Russian embassy, and thank you so much for your time. I hope our audience finds our discussion enlightening, especially considering what is happening in the world at the moment. The most annoying thing about modern journalism is they assume things happen in a vacuum. And that assumption is sort of the death knell of reason and understanding of the world, in geopolitics and otherwise. So if you look at the conflict in the Ukraine, I mean, it didn't start in 2022. There's a long history to it. Primarily 2014 was a major important milestone in that conflict. If you can broadly but succinctly just give us the context about what is happening today concerning Russia and the Ukraine, from your perspective, of course.
Yeah, well, thank you very much and welcome to Russian Embassy, first of all. Yes, I totally agree with your evaluation of the situation. I would like to say that today, unfortunately, the Western mainstream media, they're covering the issue with Russia and Ukraine intentionally decontextualized. What I mean by that is that they will try their best to deprive it of any context whatsoever, to make it look like Russia just unprovokedly decided for some reason invade Ukraine because we're afraid of democracy or anything. So just giving the vague answers that not answers at all, because don't explain anything. Yeah, so when it comes to the context of this situation, I'd like to first point out that it's not only Russia-Ukraine issue. It's much broader, and there are other players outside, most notably NATO. Because, well, if I allow myself a little flash forward before I get to the question, the problem that Russia is facing now is not from Ukraine itself. Many people say that Ukraine is not a threat in military sense to Russia, because our military potential is incomparable. But the problem is not Ukraine itself. The problem is NATO using Ukraine as a foothold against Russia.
Obviously, in Ukraine, Russia's been building forces at the Ukraine border since October 2021. And obviously it was February 2022 that the military operation started to occur. But our understanding is that the main reason for the military operation to begin in the first place was the occurrences in Donetsk and Luhansk. And our understanding is that following that, the initial response to that was obviously the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and obviously the sanctions that followed in those regions. But it's important to recognize now, obviously you've mentioned NATO, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the NATO conflict as we go along, but the initial rationale for the conflict in the first place were those two regions. Are you able to explain a little bit or confirm to us what's happening in those regions that prompted the Kremlin to feel that Russian intervention was required?
Yeah, so I was just about to, well, it actually closely connected to what I was about to say, because it's a direct consequence of the coup that took place in 2014. So before it took place, there are two projects: the Russian custom unions and the association with European Union. And the then President Yanukovych of Ukraine wanted to halt the process of associating with the European Union because it turned out that it's not that beneficial for Ukraine after all. But the EU just said that you're either with us or with Russia. That's basically blackmailing. And then the Maidan demonstrations and public unrest happened. Well, the current Kiev regime calls it revolution of dignity. What in fact happened was a constitutional coup, because there was an agreement between the opposition and the then authorities of Ukraine of the peaceful transition of power. And the guarantors of this agreement were Germany, France, and Poland. But with the acquiescence and total inaction of the above-mentioned European countries, Ukrainian opposition just violated this agreement and just took power by force. That was an unconstitutional coup took place in Kiev. And the people who disagreed with this events unfolding were the Donbas region, where the Donetsk and Lugansk, the key points of these regions, and Crimea. Crimea, let's just not switch topic for a while. Crimea decided to join the Russian Federation, and Donbas region were responded, their discontent, their disagreement, what it was replied with, not an open dialogue or like frank or democratic process or something, outright slaughter. So they used military force against civilians, and they have been using this military force since 2014.
And it's probably important to even reference, I mean, just even for our own audience's purposes, this was an article run by the BBC. So the BBC have obviously covered this, but in October 2014, our understanding is that the Ukrainian army used cluster bombs, which are banned bombs according to international conventions, against Ukrainian citizens.
Yes,
which resulted, this is according to BBC, resulted in just under 4,000 casualties. Why do you think the West isn't commenting on these comments?
Apparently anything goes if it's against Russia, because, apparently it's blinded by its narrow and selfish political interests. And we've been trying to drag West attention to the Kyiv regime's action for 8 years. We've been constantly reminding them that the people are still dying in Donbas. And these are not like regular armies or something. These are just commoners. These are people, women, children, elderly people. Just for an example, to show the depth of this tragedy, the children who were born in 2014 or later in Donbas, all they see in their lives so far are shelters. So they lived in shelters, they hide in shelters, they will see nothing but war. They should be in school now. They're 7 or 8 years old now, so they should be in school, but they can't do that because Ukrainian army kept bombarding them and killing them. Just like, this is a genocide, as our president described it. And as long as it's beneficial, because it's for the West, to keep the pressure on the Russian border, and to change Russia's policy or something, they'll just like create an epicenter of how do I call it? So it's just basically creating a big problem, a humanitarian catastrophe at Russia's border.
I think we should probably clarify, when you talk about a genocide, you don't mean a genocide of a race, you mean a political genocide, because it's a genocide against people that don't necessarily agree with the political thoughts of Kiev.
We describe it as genocide because, their ethnic majority are Russians. These are Russian people, not just by passport. Let's just, mass slaughter is no less of a crime than genocide. So even if we're like starting playing terms, it doesn't change the essence of the fact that the Ukrainian government, the Kyiv regime, was just killing its own citizens, and outright slaughtering them, and putting the atmosphere of xenophobia towards them. So the division lines they drew themselves. And even when now the Ukrainian officials are referring to like 14,000 of people killed in eastern Ukraine, they conveniently omit the fact that most of those people are the casualties of the Ukrainian army. So they were just referring to them and ask for compassion from international community, but forgetting to say that they killed those people themselves.
But that's what I'm saying. It's a political genocide as opposed to a racial genocide. Because whilst they speak Russian, they are still Ukrainians.
Yeah, they are Ukrainians by passport. They are Ukrainians by passport. If that's convenient for you, let's put it as political genocide. We see this as a genocide. We see it as a humanitarian disaster, a huge one. This is a mass human sufferings. And for 8 years we've been trying to drag attention of the Western elites, of the Western politicians, for them to exercise to use their influence over the Kyiv regime to stop the atrocities, but nothing of this happened. They preferred not to notice any of this, and not just Donbas, mind you. I'll speak about it just in a second. They preferred not to notice this, Even the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, when he was commenting on President Putin's remarks on genocide, he said it was ridiculous or laughable. Well, it can be translated from German as ridiculous or laughable. So we took this to heart, frankly speaking, because there is nothing ridiculous or laughable about people getting killed. There's nothing laughable about children being killed, women being raped. There are mass graves of civilians in Lugansk region, and there are countless footages and photographs depicting the civilian casualties that will just all fell victim of the Ukrainian side. So there can be possibly nothing laughable, and now they're just trying to summon your compassion towards Ukraine. They're suddenly humanitarians. So where all those humanitarians been for 8 years? That's the question we keep asking, and unfortunately we don't see the answer yet. Where have they all been? Why didn't they protest? Why didn't they introduce sanctions against Ukraine for killing its own population? Nothing of this happened. Instead, Western politicians went to Kiev and praised Kiev for democratic reforms.
Right, and I think it's important for people to understand is the eastern region of the Ukraine, like the Donbas region, basically they are being bombed because they don't want to form parts of the Ukraine.
They are bombed because they disagreed with the unconstitutional coup, but it could have been launched. The process could have been launched. The political process of settlement, and the Minsk agreement was the key element of that process. But the Kiev regime, again, with full acquiescence of the West, basically being drunk on impunity, at least considering that the West is on its side, will decide that they will never fulfill this agreement. They said it out loud. The Ukrainian president said that he didn't like a single article of this agreement. He didn't like, that's the quote. He's one of the top Ukrainian officials said that Ukraine will never implement Minsk agreements. So just bluntly and out loud.
Despite the fact that it was signed.
Yes, by Ukrainian president.
So just quickly on those regions, when President Putin said he's going to invade those regions, he's looking to protect the people there that have been under the boot of the Ukrainian army, which you call genocide. But number two, you also said, you chose a very important word, denazification of that region. So we do know that the Kiev regime is in alliance with neo-Nazis, actual real Nazis. There's no doubt about that. Before 2021, the West knew perfectly well what a Nazi was. Now they have no idea what it was at all. What is the role of the neo-Nazis in the East in terms of keeping Kiev's power in that area, and B, why are they so aggressive, if I may ask, to the citizens of those regions in eastern Ukraine?
Well, the neo-Nazis play an important role. They committed a lot of crimes against humanity, a lot of war crimes in Donbas, because they actively participated in bombarding and killing the innocent people in Donbas. So, this is the denazification. Because a Nazi state at Russia's border, this thing we cannot stand, especially Nazis with nuclear weapons. When President Zelensky said that we're going to redevelop nuclear weapons, now this is a direct threat to Russia.
I think many people don't understand that there's still a number of nuclear sites from the former Soviet Union still in Ukraine.
And they have the capabilities to redevelop the nuclear weapons, especially with the help of the West. This cannot stand, because Nazis with nuclear weapons, what stops them? If you take a sidestep real quickly here, even we imagine the scenario of the attack, not even Russia, but Donbas region with nuclear weapons, it's right on the border with Russia. Russia had to respond, would have to respond in this situation, and at certain point, it wouldn't even matter who started it first. It's basically the nuclear war. So this is an apocalypse scenario. We had to prevent it. So, and there was even our Ministry of Defense discovered the documents stating that Ukrainian army was preparing a full-scale assault on Donbass later in March this year. So they could have launched their attack as well, but full compliance with, with full support of the Western media, they will just say that nothing's going on. And well, if we argue that, well, they'll have to notice, well, I just remind you that they didn't notice slaughter of innocent people in Donbass. They didn't notice the Odessa massacre on 2nd of May 2014, when civilians protesting in Odessa was pushed in the local trade union's house, and one building was torched. 42 people were burnt alive. And well, 8 years later, no perpetrators have been found, no investigation carried out whatsoever. Nobody notices this in the West. Nobody tells about it in the media in the West because, well, it doesn't matter. Because it doesn't serve the purpose of demonizing Russia and blaming Russia for everything. Why do your B part of the question? Nazis will gain the overwhelming influence of the Kiev authorities, of the state authorities of Ukraine. Today, neo-Nazism is rampant in Ukraine. It's not punishable by law at all. Not anymore. Yeah. So they. Yes, so it says somewhere, but in reality, the torchlit processions in commemoration of Ukrainian Nazi World War II collaborators, they are guarded by police, for one thing. So that just one of the markers that's saying it's a state-approved, state-supported policy, like Stepan Bandera, marches in commemoration of Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera was a World War II Nazi collaborator. Him and his accomplices are responsible for Volhynia massacre, the events that claimed lives of 50,000 innocent people, from 50 to 60,000. Can you imagine that? And such people like him are now revered in Ukraine, take pictures with swastika and other Nazi emblems and symbols. By the way, according to one of the laws in Ukraine, the communist symbols are banned. They're prohibited by law, like the red star, the red banner, sickle and hammer, everything that comes from Soviet side is prohibited, but swastika and SS emblem from Nazi Germany are not prohibited, and the emblem of SS Galicia division, or Galichina, how we call it in Russian-speaking segment of the internet, well, Russian-speaking segment of planet, their emblems are not prohibited. They march with these emblems and while demonstrating them. So Nazis have the overwhelming influence. Some people argued that, well, how can this be true? Because, well, President Zelensky is Jewish by origin. That's a very curious argument, if I may put it, because, well, it doesn't make sense for one thing. If we look back in the past again, not all Germans were part of Nazi party. Not all Germans were Nazis, or like shared Nazis ideals or Nazis ideology. It didn't prevent Nazi Germany from starting World War II. It didn't prevent Nazi Germany from committing heinous crimes against humanity, killing millions of people, both on the battlefield and in concentration camps. It didn't prevent anything of the kind. Yes, not all the Germans were Nazis, but the fact that Germany was a Nazi state before it collapsed in 1945, was defeated in World War II. And the second part of this is, well, actually, so what if he's from Jewish origin? It's actually reference to Holocaust. Holocaust was a tragedy. It's a universal fact. But are we seriously implying that just because he's Jewish, he's some kind of just by default immune to Nazism? Are we saying that people of certain origins are immune to Nazism and others are not? This is called racism.
The Azov Battalion is a well-known thing. I mean,
Yes.
It's been commented on by the Human Rights Commission for Human Rights, and they've specifically drawn reference to the acts of the Azov Battalion as being what they described as war crimes,
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to ignore them. They did, however, claim that the percentages of the Azov Battalion were relatively low, less than 10%. But I think the recent estimations are that the Azov Battalion makes up around 20% or just over 20% of the Ukrainian army.
Yeah, and the Azov Battalion is just one of the examples. There are other battalions or other groups that follow the same ideology. And the thing here with the Nazism, it's when Ukraine was vehemently abolishing all its references to the Soviet Union, they call it desovietization or decommunization. There was an example in Kiev. One of the tram stations was called after Nikolai Vatutin. He's a World War II Soviet hero who contributed greatly to liberating Ukraine from Nazi invaders, and was renamed in honor of Roman Shukhevich, again World War II Nazi collaborator. So it's manifested clearly in Ukraine. It cannot be unnoticed unless you deliberately do not notice the manifestations of Nazism in Ukraine. And Azov Battalion is a great example of how the Ukrainian armed forces getting Nazified and getting the Nazi ideology find its way to the main core of the Ukrainian army. And there are a lot of other battalions committed such crimes in Donbass, like Tornado Battalion. They've committed torture to the war prisoners of war, tortured civilians. These are documented crimes. There are proof to this. Even Ukrainian side admitted that Tornado Battalion committed those crimes. So yes, Nazism is rampant, and it's astounding how the Europe does not notice this, given the background with Nazism in Europe during the World War II.
So why do you think it is? Why do you think that the Western media is ignoring it? I mean, we've obviously seen situations of Russian media being, should we say, cut short or banned. Things like RT News.
Well, for one thing, saying that there is actually not. Well, when you start a certain line, you have to pursue it to the very end. Otherwise, it'll just crash really badly. So if you say that there actually is Nazism in Ukraine, that actually proves Russia's point that there is Nazism in Ukraine, and the West hasn't been doing anything about it, let alone promoting it, and actually approving it and turning a blind eye on everything they do. So because it's aimed against Russia, because it helps prolonging the war. It helps, the global geopolitical war in the broader sense against Russian Federation. It prolongs the hostilities in Ukraine. I mean, what's going on now? Because the fostered Nazi battalions, they do resist. They hide behind the back of civilians. They use the civilian infrastructure, like we've seen the photos just recently. One of the Nazi battalions was using a synagogue just to hide from the fire, using them as headquarters, or as some point they use it for military purposes. So speaking of Jewish president, so they use the synagogues with no problem. For military purposes. They do it deliberately because they know we won't shoot. Russia is aiming military infrastructure, not civil infrastructure. They hide in the cities. They don't. There was just take note that there was no clashes in the open field. Basically retreated to the cities because it's easier to hide behind the civilians there.
And if I'm correct, the UN released a statement on the 20th of March, which was about, I believe, a month after the conflict started, and they stated 975 civilians have been killed, which is a tragedy, but at the same time, it's a very low number. More people have been murdered in South Africa, 3 times more people have been murdered in South Africa in the same period of time, which leads credence to the fact that the military operation is targeting military objects. Or fighters.
Because we stated clearly that our 2 objectives is demilitarization and denazification, not even occupation of Ukraine, not killing civilians. exactly. We're doing exactly what we announced we would do, and as I said, it was a forced move. So if there was a way just to avoid all this, but it takes two to tango. But it took NATO's political will to have the guarantees for the Russians, and actually, if we get back quickly to that point, if Ukraine does not qualify as a NATO member, what was the problem of giving us the guarantees that it will now not join NATO?
The guarantee, obviously, being
Ukraine being the neutral. So what was the problem? Yeah, what was the problem? Well, because they wanted to put pressure on Russia, because Nazified Ukraine is a point of pressure against Russia and against Russian civilians, against Russians who stay in Ukraine, against people who are sympathetic with Russia. That's the main point behind it. And speaking of casualties, as I said, it is tragic, and it's tragic first and foremost for Russia and Ukraine. But instead of sending humanitarian aid, let's say, to Ukraine, NATO countries prefer to send weapons, pouring oil on flames. Let's say Russia, on the other hand, delivered tons, even as we speak, it delivered tons of humanitarian aid to various regions of Ukraine, not just to Donbass, not just to Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, but even to Kiev region, to Kherson region. We're delivering humanitarian aid will help the civilians. Not Ukrainians doing this, not the West do this. They only concerned about weapons and how much lethal weapons, how many units of lethal weapons should they bring to Ukraine. So instead of resolving the humanitarian crisis, they wanted to drag on as long as possible, because this is a very good pretext to introduce new sanctions, to blame Russia for something more. It's a fertile ground for provocations against Russia, because if the media do not cover the entire situation rather than just using it as a propaganda tool, anything goes. Even the fake footages go, like from Star Wars, or how the Italian newspaper La Stampa, the Russian side posted the photos of Donetsk being bombarded, suffering missile attack from the Ukrainian side. They posted the same photos and signed it as Russia attacks Kiev. Simple as that.
Right. So, Alex, I'm sorry, we're running a little bit out of time, so I want to sort of condense the last two questions into one, if I may. The response to Russia by the West has been, I suspect, much quicker than we ever anticipated, and not just from a sort of a national way, but also Western corporations. They're saying, "Oh, we're pulling out of Russia. This is terrible. We can't serve Big Macs anymore, and we can't have MasterCard, and we can't have all of those things within the Russian Federation." Number one, are you surprised by the swiftness and the fact that ostensibly private companies are taking a moral stance on a very, if I may say, regional conflict? And number two, do you feel that perhaps, and this is a big perhaps, that the pretext to remove all those things from Russia or to sanction in this way might actually have been some way calculated to happen in a material way?
Well, maybe. I would like to say that, the West is trying to benefit economically from this situation, trying to isolate Russia, but these attempts are doomed to fail. Russia cannot be isolated because, for one thing, the global economy is, in fact, indeed globalized, and you just can't ruin it at a whim for nothing. And the economic consequences of the sanctions that the West imposed on Russia, they're echoing across the globe, even for countries that are remote from Eastern Europe, and the West itself feeling the backlash of its own sanctions. Not everything is go the way they thought it would go. I guess one of the versions what might happen, that the massiveness of sanctions was the intention. The idea behind them was to make Russia fall quickly, but it failed because Russia has a pretty self-reliant economy, and we will manage. Of course, we do feel the pinch of the sanctions, but we will manage because there are a lot of tools in Russia's toolbox to, get things going, we do have the same question for the corporations. Why didn't they withdraw, or they protested somehow against other atrocities, like let's say what that were committed by U.S. in Iraq, because there are millions civilians killed, over a million of civilians killed by U.S. in Iraq. No one protested this. No one was pulling out from the business activity in this country. So it's politically motivated. We get that it is politically motivated. Some countries are just reluctant to go. They're just, freezing their activities, or they're not freezing. So it's volatile in the situation. It can be somewhat surprising, like from a commoner's standpoint, that it is unprecedented pressure. It is, but we're not living under sanction it's not our first time on sanctions, because sanctions were introduced in 2014, for example, when Russia and Crimea reunited. There were sanctions as well, and not that the West was helping Russia to flourish all this time. Let's be honest. So sanctions are not something new, and even in 2014, the West said that it was devastating sanctions, that Russia's going to fall, and even the then President Barack Obama said that if I'm quoting his correctly, that he tore to pieces Russia's economy. So it's not the first time the West trying to strangle Russia economically or trying to benefit from it. But as I said, sanctions are a double-edged sword, and they also feel the pinch of this sanctions. So I think it's just my assumption that regular Russians, common Russians, can be somewhat surprised, and it's understandable. But more surprise comes from the thought that why just against Russia? Why didn't it happen any time before, when the U.S. and the West itself committed crimes against humanity, when he ruined Yugoslavia, NATO ruined Yugoslavia in 1999, defensive alliance. When defensive alliance ruined Libya in 2011, no one introduced sanctions. No one protested. No one issued any calls to stop this atrocity. Well, there were calls, but there were no sanctions, no sanctional pressure. So the West was trying to use its dominant position in global finances and in global trade to its advantage, but it's purely politically motivated. So the West just pursues its narrow and selfish political agenda. It has nothing to do with humanitarian crisis, of humanitarian concerns of the West. We've seen their humanitarian concerns for 8 years. They are selective, if we put it mildly, so it has nothing to do. Otherwise, they would have intervened earlier and urged the Ukrainian government to stop these atrocities. So we consider this a politically motivated sanctions.
I know you've mentioned that you're not surprised by the sanctions within Russia, but obviously we've seen sanctions being imposed on Russian citizens outside of Russia. So we've seen obviously what's happened with Roman Abramovich, with Chelsea Football Club in the UK. We've seen other Russian assets being seized around the world. And obviously we've seen that fundamentally the West historically prides itself on property rights, specifically private property ownership rights, and we're seeing left, right and center countries around the world confiscating Russian assets as if the ownership rights don't really mean anything. Now, I know that the Kremlin has mentioned that he's not, at this point in time, doing the same within Russia. He's not going to be confiscating foreign assets. What's your view on the West's approach to this?
Well, this is actually the surprising part. It's when we're surprised with swiftness, is that when we're surprised with the swiftness that the West discarded everything that has been boasting of for decades. Yeah, such as the things as you mentioned, all the human rights, tolerance, the right of private property and stuff. All this was discarded in the blink of an eye, from a historical perspective. So it's one of the mechanisms to whip up the global Russophobia, because we've seen the examples of how people that have no relations to Russia whatsoever, even brands that have no relations with Russia, but people think they're Russian, they also get damaged, like the Latvian vodka Stoli, for example. Russian cats, Russian trees, even. Because Russian Turgenev oak was disqualified from competition, like European tree, I think.
And I believe they tried to cancel the first astronauts in space, which is a historical fact.
So they cancelled. It's like this Twitter cancellation culture, if I may put it this way. Well, tendency, how to put it correctly. So trying to erase Russia, but Russia is not like a painting on the wall; it can be just erased, this will have very dire consequences, like at global level, because this is a Pandora box. From now on, the sports are no longer beyond politics, culture is no longer beyond politics. So the question rises: should any crisis occur in the future, do we have to do the same thing? Do we have to abandon like other nations' culture, music, and citizens? Even Russians that are targeted abroad, they have nothing to do with Russian foreign policy. They're just, they're Russians by birth, something we don't choose. If they're proud of their country, their culture, they no longer can do it safely because they've been targeted. This is very disturbing. This is a worrying, alarming event. Even for us as Russians, because our compatriots get targeted, even their assets, such as like yachts and Chelsea clubs, the West used its favorite smokescreen, like fighting with corruption and oligarchs, but oligarchs from other countries are doing fine. They're not targeted as vehemently as Russian oligarchs, so it's just another pretext to basically get a hold of Russian assets. That's pillaging. Basically, that's pillaging, and blatant Russophobia shows us that all those concerns about human rights, equality, tolerance and stuff, all this can be discarded in a second. So the West didn't stand true to its word. So first it promoted and it taught us Russians as a young Russian Federation state in the 90s, they taught us to promote this freedom of speech, like freedom of expression, freedom of whatever, and now all of a sudden, all those freedoms can be discarded if the West thinks so. RT and Sputnik that are banned from broadcasting in Europe, in North America, it's a prime example to this. It's censorship in full sense of word. There's nothing wrong with content that produced by RT or Sputnik. It's an alternative viewpoint to what like CNN or BBC is saying. True, but it doesn't make it worse. It doesn't make it illegal, but they brand just Russian propaganda. There's no such violation of being Russian propaganda. It's not violating the press code of conduct in any regard. It's an alternative viewpoint, and we've been taught, like as a state, like the West were like used its mentor tone to say that Russia, you should like introduce true freedoms, true democracy. But apparently true freedoms and democracies when you align with the West. But the West just does not, as it showed itself, it does not tolerate different points of view, alternative points of view.
That's actually my final question. The West thrives on tolerance, democracy, equality, but it appears to be, and we are Western people. We keep telling our audience, we are people from the West. We love Western cultural values, especially Judeo-Christian values. These are the values with which we grew up with and which we wish to continue. But the more we live in Western culture, the more alien it becomes to us, because it appears for all the tolerance and equality and diversity they want, it's increasingly becoming extremely narrow in terms of those particular definitions. And if you expand that to international relations, countries can be as free as they want as long as they align to the UN and the World Bank and America, hegemony and all the rest of it. As long as you're liberal, you can be as freely liberal as you wish. But if you take a turn left or right of liberal, you're sort of a pariah state. You're out of the club completely. Yeah. So based on that, do you feel that the Ukraine conflict can drastically reorganize the world as we know it in time to come?
It's hard to predict such a global thing, but what Russia pursues is the multipolar world without just one unified center, because too much power concentrated in one place will just pushes you, will seduces you to, misuse or abuse such power. So multipolar world is the world when everyone enjoys its culture, and all cultures in all states, all the sovereignties are equal, and we deal as equals, so that there will be no unified center that tells us what to do, what's wrong, what is bad. It's too much power for one institution, or for one man, or let alone for one man, for one institution. It's even that's even too much. So, as I said, it's hard to predict, but well, if world is going to change, we only hope that it will change for the better. And what I really hope is that, like, common Westerners, common people in the West, or who think they belong to the Western culture, will also draw lessons from this. So these are I guess it's painful to watch that the values you've been taught and you grew up with turned out to be a fake, or at least not so universal as they were presented to you. So it will actually draw some lessons from it, learn from it, and make them bring them back to what they originally were, bring them to what people truly believed in, to give it its full form of sense. Because nowadays, unfortunately, from Russia's standpoint, these are nothing but cliches, hollow cliches of their former being. It actually means nothing. You can be praised for democratic reforms and kill civilians at the same time. You can be as autocratic as you want, but as long as you're aligned with the UN, IMF, and other institutions, you're fine. You'll be praised as a liberal democrat. But as long as you do not align with the interest of the West, you're being alienated. You've been demonized in the media. This is a very concerning issue, because in the world where there is no rules, in the world where we cannot tell one thing from another, it's chaos, and no one will benefit from chaos. It's a very dangerous game, with really high stakes. And there can be no complacency that, this will, we will evade that. This will never concern us. It will concern different people faster than you can imagine, because erosion of of the human rights, of the equality of nations, this is important. And it's important especially for Russia, because our memories, our recollections of World War II, as we call it, the Great Patriotic War, are really vivid, and they stay with us, because we paid a really huge price to defeat the Nazis, 27 million of our compatriots. And the creation of the UN was one of the most positive, best outcomes of the new world, post-World War II world. This is something we cherish. It's something we attach great value to. And it should be. It should be truly what it is. Human rights should be human rights everywhere, not just in Europe. There is no division like human rights in Europe, human rights elsewhere. Human rights are human rights. Rule of law is rule of law. And it should be, true to what they mean. They should not be turned into a political tool of narrow political interests. So you can't just blame them. Let's say dictators are one of the most commonly used words, like dictator this, dictator that. Even our president are being blamed in the West, or the place always reproaches our president for remaining in power for too long. But German Chancellor Angela Merkel, for example, if my memory serves me right, she's been Chancellor for 15 years, and nobody had any problem with this whatsoever. Nobody complained that, Germans, right of German people are somehow violated or anything, so everything was fine. And Donald Trump, for example, it was his first term, but somehow he was also blamed for even US media as a dictator. So it doesn't correlate with what you do. It correlates what the Western powers, what the Western elites W as, or paint you in certain colors. So this is bad, because it erodes the meaning of the words, because anything goes now, and it's really easy to get confused. And I do understand why people get confused around the conflict, because, as I said, it's intentionally decontextualized to deprive you of any opportunity to truly understand what's going on and why it's going on. So.
Which actually brings me on to my last question, and it's just a question because we're both gun fanatics, we both like our guns, and we're very privileged to live in a country where you can still have private ownership of guns. Although, obviously around the world we're seeing the gun sentiment, especially in places like the United States, which has a very pro-2A kind of feeling to it, and we're seeing that gun rights are obviously under attack there. There's a load of speculation as to why that might be. It's noticed that in November 2014, I think the Kremlin gave an interview to the Washington Post, and it was quoted as saying, you can do a lot more with weapons and politeness than just politeness. And a lot of people took this to mean that he was like he had a pro-gun sentiment. What's the Russian view on gun rights?
Well, it's a complicated issue. For one thing, there are pro-guns activists in Russia. Well, they just promote their point of view. There's like everywhere, basically, there are someone who are against it because we used to be in the country with guns are not allowed like widespreadingly. Pardon my English. In wide use among the civilians. It's a very delicate issue, and I'm not a gun expert, and not I'm an expert in like Russian civil law, but what I can say for sure, it is delicate issue. It cannot be rushed. So to my personal opinion, it can be only resolved through nationwide consensus. Until we reach that, I guess the position would not shift. So we'll stay where we are right now.
What is that position at the moment?
So you just as far as my knowledge goes, please don't consider it like an expert view or anything. So you can get the gun, but not like the firearms or like gas pistols or something. You can do that, but you still need to get a license. So it's not that easily obtained in Russia. So you have to like present certain documents to have the guns. Not that you can carry them around, but you can store them. But you have to pass through the legal procedure to get that. So this is, as far as we can go in guns issue for a while. So there are guns, they can be purchased in specialized stores, but as I said, against the documents.
So you would say that Russia's relatively strict on gun control, which actually brings on to the question, which is obviously in Ukraine we've seen that they've been handing out assault rifles to the citizenry like it was candy, and it's obviously we've seen a lot of it.
Again, it's politically motivated, and it's trying. The Ukrainian propaganda, the Kiev regime tries to portray this as like a nationwide patriotic resistance, which is hardly so, because these guns have been distributed with no control whatsoever, and this uncontrolled guns, with zero control, lead to only one thing: organized crime. And that's what happens in the Ukrainian cities, as if the situation wasn't hard enough with all those nationalists hiding in schools and hospitals and using civilians as human shields, or just strictly mob them while striving for resources. They're now holding guns, and if once they're given the rifle, you're free to do whatever you want. So this leads to impunity. This weakens the police force. This weakens the rule of law, because it's uncontrolled gun distribution. So who knows what might happen? Getting back to that phrase that you can do much more with the guns, true, but not necessarily something good. Yeah, so.
Perfectly understand.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's it for me.
All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for the opportunity and for your kind acceptance of our kind invitation. And if people, I know this is strange, but the Russian Federation, the embassy, is actually has your own YouTube channel.
We have the social media platforms, and YouTube is one of them. Yeah, so we're well, to our humble capabilities, we're trying to develop our YouTube channel. Is this the part where I'm supposed to say like like and subscribe? Find description below. Yeah.
I'll do that. I'll do it. So for those watching, the YouTube channel is in the description below. So if you wish to subscribe, feel free to do so.
Thank you for joining us, and we really do appreciate it. We know you're busy. I'm sure you're getting quite a lot of requests for speaking, given the nature of the conflict and the timeliness of it, but we do appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Alex.